Hi everyone. So today's lesson we are looking at some of the management strategies that are being used in order to try to protect the carbon and water cycle, and this is the last couple of lessons that we need to look at. So what strategies have we got that are designed to restore equilibrium to the carbon cycle? And we're going to have a look at wetland restoration, afforestation, sustainable agriculture practices, and putting controls on greenhouse gas emissions. So if you remember, wetlands are places like salt marshes, peatlands, mangroves. Mangrove is that picture at the bottom right there where the roots of the trees are really visible above the water, swampy areas, that kind of thing. And they are places where the water table is close to or at the surface, so the ground is permanently wet, permanently saturated. And wetlands are really important to the carbon cycle because of the carbon that they store within their system. They occupy about 6 to 9% of the Earth's land surface, and they contain 35% of the carbon stored on the land, terrestrial carbon. But they don't necessarily look particularly attractive, and they take up space. And so what humans have been doing is draining them, getting rid of them, so that they're more attractive to tourists, so that they can use that land for agriculture. And it's only recently that we've started to realise just how vital those wetland ecosystems are in terms of their carbon sink ability. And so the obvious thing to do in order to try to reverse some of that damage is to restore some of those wetlands. So this is looking at the USA. So population growth, economic development, urbanisation have put huge pressure on the wetlands in America. In the lower 48 states, the wetland area has halved since 1600. That's put a huge amount of carbon and methane back into the atmosphere from where it had been stored. There's just a little article down there on the left that looks at planning to drain the Congo peat bog for oil, and how people are up in arms about this as an idea because of the amount of carbon that would release as they drain that massive peat bog in order to get at the oil that would be released into the atmosphere. So restoring wetlands is big business really around the world, particularly developed countries. In the 20th century, Canada's provinces lost 70% of their wetlands, and they have shown how successful restoration can actually be. And they've had a very successful project there in Canada to restore a lot of their wetlands. This was Donald Trump revoking Obama's rule that protected the wetlands and streams. So during Trump's presidency, the wetlands of America were not protected. Hopefully this is yet another one of those things that Biden will restore and reinstate, being the climate activist that he seems to be, and doing a much better job at protecting the environment so far. RAMSAR is actually an organisation whose purpose is to protect wetlands. And you can have a look at that little YouTube clip there about RAMSAR and what they stand for and what they do. And in the UK, we've been restoring wetlands too. So up to 400 hectares of farmland in East Cambridgeshire is currently being converted back to wetland. And you can see that at the bottom there. So when you restore a wetland, what you have to do is you have to bring the water table back to close to or at the surface to recreate the waterlogged conditions that you drained initially. So you can reconnect the area to a river by taking out any flood embankments or management strategies that you've put in place to drain that land. Or you can take away the sea defences and let the sea reclaim in the case of salt marshes. You can drain, you can put channels in to divert the water. You can block any sort of drainage ditches that you might have put in to bring that waterlogged condition back to the land. Did you know that we've got some wetlands quite close to us at Walthamstow? And I've put that link on there so you can have a little look at the Walthamstow wetlands. And it's interesting to think that they're not necessarily in the deep countryside, but we have got some wetlands on the outskirts of London there that we can utilise. So the second thing that we can do to manage the carbon cycle and restore some equilibrium is afforestation, planting trees. Planting trees in areas where we've deforested them to restore those forests, or in areas that have never been forests. And this is because the trees are carbon sinks. They take in CO2 through photosynthesis. They also reduce flood risk and soil erosion as they intercept the rainfall and reduce surface runoff. So they are benefiting both the carbon cycle and the water cycle. One of the things we can do is to protect the rainforests. So we looked at the RED scheme, where we're actually giving a monetary value to the forests as an incentive for those LIDCs to stop chopping them down, to conserve them. And that seems to be the only way to do it, is to give them some sort of monetary value. China has had a massive afforestation project going since 1978, trying to basically stop the desertification of the Gobi Desert and to plant a huge amount of trees. And you can have a look at that. And I've also put a link on there to Iceland, who are also reforesting their country. All of these links are on there. You can have a look at how we are growing trees in test tubes so that we can actually hold on to their genetics in case we get a situation where certain species of trees become extinct in the future. There's a link on there to an article looking at how urban forests are just as important as rainforests in this scheme. And you can also have a look at that Guardian article looking at planting billions of trees to save the planet. A couple of other articles here. So tree planting rise needs to happen quickly. Tree planting has mind-blowing potential to tackle climate change. So rewilding, putting nature back as it was, and putting back that buffer, putting back that carbon sink, that natural carbon sink, in order to restore equilibrium where we've created this disequilibrium in the cycle. There's a couple of other articles there, how to plant trees and save the planet. And the general election from 2019, it was quite interesting to see both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats were going head to head and pledging tree planting as one of the key points of their manifestos to be elected. However, we do need to look at the other side of the argument. It's not as easy as just planting trees, as this article alludes to. So tree planting is not a simple silver bullet solution. And actually other actions might have greater potential for reducing the problem. So taking bold, rapid steps to reduce deforestation and greenhouse gas emission would perhaps be better than just planting trees. And sometimes this overshadows those actions. And the other problem is that when we plant trees, we tend to just plant one species, a monoculture, or maybe a couple of species, nowhere near as much biodiversity than a native rainforest. There's a really interesting part of David Attenborough's Human episode. If you haven't yet seen it, you should really watch it, where they have the indigenous people collecting seeds over many years. And then they put them all together on a blanket on the ground, all of these seeds that they've collected, and they shake them all together. And there they've actually got a representation of the biodiversity of the rainforest. And they can plant those mixed up seeds and recreate something on a par to virgin rainforest, which is not what we're doing when we're planting one species of tree. One other problem is that if you take agricultural land and plant trees on it, we still need to grow food. We still need to feed the population. So what this tends to do is have a bit of a knock-on effect. And so if people's agricultural land has been planted on with forests, they then deforest another area in order to find some land to grow their crops on. So it sort of just has this negative knock-on effect, and they're still deforesting. But the first priority to increase the number of trees on the planet has to be to reduce the current rate of deforestation and maintain what we have, because virgin forest is much better than whatever we replace it with. Then we've got agricultural practices. So overcultivation, so growing too many crops, overgrazing, putting too many animals on the land, and intensification, so trying to use chemicals to get every ounce of produce out of the land that you possibly can, are unsustainable practices and have led to soil erosion and releasing huge quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. We know that cattle ranches, livestock farming, produce a huge amount of methane from all that farting and burping that those cows do, releasing methane gas into the atmosphere. And also the paddy fields where they grow rice. We know we're recreating swampy conditions and we're growing organic material in that anaerobic situation without oxygen, and that is releasing huge quantities of methane. And we're increasing our growth of rice to meet the population growth of countries like China and India and those South Asian countries. So what ways can we reduce our emissions from agriculture? It's all about how we manage our practices. So one of the things that we can do is to not plough the soil. When you plough the soil, you drive a tractor up and down and you basically turn the soil over. When you do that, you expose more of that soil to the air. So oxidation increases and that soil is exposed to being washed away by the rain, blown away by the wind. So by not ploughing, we can conserve some of that organic content and we can reduce the amount of oxidation, the amount of carbon that's being released. Another thing that you can do is grow your crops amongst the trees. We've talked about before growing crops under the trees. How about in the second picture down there where you grow your crops in between the trees? So a row of trees, then a row of crops, so an area of crops, then another row of trees, then another area of crops. So then protecting the soil against erosion with the roots of the trees binding it together. Another thing that we do, when we harvest the crops from the fields, we take the whole thing and then you chop off the carrot leaves, you chop off the potato leaves and just take the actual vegetable. And we know that in the natural world, the nutrient cycle relies on that decomposition of organic material to put nutrients back into the soil. So what about if we take the stems and the leaves and we put them back on the field after the harvest to put those nutrients back into the soil to protect that soil against erosion? Another thing we can do is to avoid using heavy machinery on wet soils because that compacts the soil and makes the soil essentially impermeable, and so you get surface runoff. In lots of countries you will have probably seen, if you've travelled anywhere, this kind of terracing that you see in the second picture from the bottom, where you get those steps in the landscape. And that is done to try to slow down the runoff, to try to keep the moisture within the soil and stop the soil blowing away and washing away, and to keep it together. And lastly, we can look at introducing new strains of crops like rice. So using genetic modification, using interbreeding to be able to grow crops that will grow in drier conditions, crops that produce less methane, that kind of thing. And then managing keeping cows as well. There are certain things we can do. So it's the methane that comes from the cows farting and burping. And this comes from the fact that when they eat the grass, you then get a fermentation process in their stomach. So there's lots of work going on to look at ways that you can reduce that gas that they produce. One of the things they found to be quite successful is getting the cows to eat food which has got garlic within it, and that tends to reduce the fermentation and reduces the amount of methane that they then produce. If you watch that YouTube clip there about this, you'll see that the big issue with this currently is that if you give the cows this garlic food to eat, it makes their milk taste of garlic, and nobody really wants garlic flavoured milk. So we're not there yet, but we are coming up with technologies. The other thing is for the manure, to manage the manure. So how about we actually take all of the manure from the cattle ranch and we control the way it decomposes. So we put it into an anaerobic container and we capture the methane from it, and then we use that as a source of renewable energy. So we're actually utilising that methane in a way that's going to actually benefit us. This was a story a couple of years ago in the paper looking at Ireland and how they've chosen to close their peat bogs in order to fight climate change. People buy this peat. So if you go to the garden centre, you buy peat to put on your garden to make it more fertile, basically. And when you buy compost, you can buy peat-free compost. And it's important to look for that. Because if not, then it's just been dug out of one of these peatland areas. And we know that the peat bogs, these peatland areas, are really important stores of carbon. So if we can protect them, that's going to be better going forward. So I've put this link on there. You can have a look at this article of 5 cheap ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere that people can use in their daily lives. And then that was just a link there to some sporting stars who have started looking at their carbon emissions and how they can offset them and reduce them. So you've got your questions to get your notes for that lesson into your books, or you've done your notes as you've gone along through the lesson.